Omniversica show that I've seen, and I've seen all of them, were very diverse in subject. You had a co-host with you, Art Durkee, who you kind of played off with, although both of you give different insights. You can tell how different your views are in art, even in that. Talk about the genesis of Omniversica, and then we'll get into some of the specific shows and some of the tangents that were particularly memorable.
Well, I was from the late 90s for 3 or 4 years. I was doing this cabaret called Balls in Minneapolis when I lived there. And it was a cabaret at midnight on Saturday when this woman named Leslie Ball would have people perform. It was a $5 admission, and people like me would read poems, others would do stand-up comedy, etc. And it was at this place called the Southern Theater in Minneapolis, and uh, the guy who did the technical stuff for her, all volunteer, was a guy named Dave Wesley, and he eventually he did that until I left Minneapolis in '03. But he eventually opened up this little restaurant or cafe in downtown Minneapolis called Sursum Corda. And he had a website called sursumcorda.com. And he streamed a lot of stuff. He did little talk show shit with usually mostly bad musicians and bad artists from Minneapolis. He had what looked like in his basement an almost fully functioning radio studio that could be, in any radio station. And so he had asked me to come and read a couple of times at his cafe, Sursum Corda, and I did. And it's actually the only place I think I've ever made money for performing or doing art. Was I think I made $10 or $20 the two times. So either 20 or $40 is what I made there. And then he asked me at one point, would I like to do some kind of show, because he wanted to do some show on art. Now this is '03. This was at '02, end of '02. So this was 2 or 3 years before YouTube came along, and it was actually before podcasting came along. So this was internet radio in its sort of Neolithic days. So I said, well, what do you want me to do? And I just go on and talk. I need to have something. So he asked me. I pitched the idea. I said, let me interview people who are interesting or intelligent in the arts and sciences. And I said, though, I'm going to see if I can get someone to host it with me. And so I asked Art Durkee, who was coming to my Uptown Poetry group at the time, to do so. And I picked Art because he was different from me. He was very much more sort of the flaming liberal type. I'm more moderate. And so he agreed to do that. We would go once a month whenever the show was scheduled. It was usually, I think, on a weekend, but some of them might have been in the middle of the week in an evening. At the time, I was working, '03, I was working my job for Hennepin County there, and then I ended up moving, and I did the last 3 or 4 shows I did remotely from Texas when we moved here. But we did the show, we recorded it. I basically got all of the guests, and we did the shows. And usually, sometimes there were 2 guests, sometimes there was 1, and we talked for 45 minutes to an hour. Art and I played off of one another fairly well. And so that was basically the genesis of it. We did the first show, which was in January of '03. It was just him and I basically ruminating. So there's really not much there. I think Art and I both read a couple of poems. Dave Wesley put some music on. The interesting thing is when I eventually, late last year, put Omniversica back online after like almost a dozen years hiatus, I couldn't use some of the music that Dave Wesley had used in the original shows that I still have on CDs because YouTube would detect that they were copyrighted material, so I had to drop some of that. But the things that we spoke of, I did end up using. So the first show that actually had a guest was the second one, James Emanuel. And it's interesting, just yesterday I saw on Vimeo, someone saw I'm not sure whether, well, do I have Omniversica on Vimeo? I think I do. So it was either the Omniversica show with James, or it was the show that I did about James last year. A cousin of James James Emanuel, that lives in Denver, emailed me or contacted me through Vimeo, and I sent something back to her. It was about a month ago. She contacted me, thanking me for doing the show. So James Emmanuel is a poet that I've written a number of pieces about, done a couple of shows about. I've got him reading some poems, some poem videos I've done of him. I've been trying to promote him. He died, I think, in late 2013, and it was a very, very good interview. He appeared with Jean Magren, who also appeared later on the Dan Schneider video interview show on James after his death. Jean had
One of the things that you should mention too is he later does a written interview. The intellect seems much more apparent there than it does in this audio interview, because while he does make some points here or there, you and Art more or less dominate the scenario. Art seems a little bit overwhelmed towards the end that he got to speak with James Emmanuel, but I don't see the deep intellect that I'm able to read within his written interview that I see in the audio interview.
Well, yeah, and this is partly Dave Wesley. The shows had gone offline in 2005 or so. They were gone from Sursum Corda. Sursum Corda, if you type it up, is sort of like a shell site now. I don't think he has anything up there of any value. What kind of annoyed me and also annoyed Art was that Dave Wesley never pushed these shows. I wouldn't have mind even doing from Texas remotely, doing shows remotely for a few more years. I think we could have established an identity, and who knows, we may have even been able to make some money off of these shows eventually. The way podcasts do now. Who knows? I could have had 12, 13 years of doing this and made a half decent living doing it. I don't know. But Dave Wesley didn't have the foresight or the vision to see that that's the way it should go. He didn't anticipate YouTube, I guess, and he valued more of his sort of gossipy little radio shows with these bad musicians from Minneapolis than he did these shows. As far as James, yeah, I mean, you don't get as much here. Same thing with Jean Magren. It's basically introducing James. I don't think at that time James had done any kind of shows extended like this, and so he was calling in from Paris. Well, we had called him in. Wesley had called to Paris and gotten him. So it was actually using telephone stuff. So, I mean, it's good. I think it's a very good show. It's not a great show. The written interview certainly displays James more. And it's a good thing that I got the written interview in '07 at the time I did, because probably within a couple of years after that, James's mind tended to, he wasn't what he was. I'm not saying that he had gone senile, but he didn't seem to be as in touch with reality in certain ways. He and Jean Magren, for example, had a falling out the last few years before James's death. To this day, I don't know the reason why, and Magren himself says he has no idea the reason why. James seemed to get paranoid or whatnot. And also, I think James in this Omniversica, a woman who he was involved with, Godelieve Simone, appears there as well. She was considered like one of the two girlfriends that he had later in life. A woman named Marie France was another one. So it's interesting. It's one of those things, though, that 50 or 100 years from now, if James gets due as a major 20th century American poet, it'll be something that people can be free to use, long after I and you and the people alive today does. So it's good in that sense.
The other thing to mention about that too is James did a early 90s interview that I have heard, and he seemed to be full of much more fired, so to speak, than he was in this interview.
That's the one I put up. That's the one I put up. The Lost interview.
Perhaps that was the only one I could find, so likely you did put it up. But he seems to be full of energy, full on attack towards the establishment, as opposed to here when he's he's the wise old man going into senility, as you said, that he doesn't seem to possess the strength. There's a notable moment where you ask him to name some bad poets, and he refuses.
Well, yeah, and that's
to mention anyone.
That's That's typical of people in academia. And James had spent decades in academia, it should be noted. He did often rail about what he called the blacklist, meaning black academics who blacklisted him from being published in the U.S. I can believe that. I don't know the reality of that because James also, after his son was killed by a cop, left the U.S. And so by going across the Atlantic and not really publishing that much. And to be fair, James's poetry, basically his productive poetry period, it probably ends around 1990. He started doing these jazz haiku, which range from passable to execrable. No one in their right mind is going to talk about jazz haiku as being the major stuff that James did. James uh, liked to claim that he had come up with the idea of jazz haiku, which is on the face of it false, because I knew people in the early mid 80s when I started getting into poetry who were doing haikus speaking to jazz. James may have a claim to say that he coined the term jazz haiku, but in no way, shape, nor form did he invent the idea of a jazz haiku. That's just nonsense. But James may not have known this since he had left America around the time that was happening. Probably wasn't active in the arts in terms of readings, probably because he was in academia for years before that. So he was in effect he insulated himself from the very organ, the academia that could have promoted him. He drew away, and that's sort of like spurning the National Football League. If you're a great college football player here in America, there's only one place that you can make it nowadays because the MFA power structure is set up in that very way, just to screw with people. So that's basically the interview with James. It was a good, solid interview, but it was nothing special.
The third interview was the best at that point.
Yeah.
You could argue the introduction of you and Art Durkee was also a quite a good interview, or at least show in and of itself. But this one was the best. Carl Sagan's former wife and his son Dorian Sagan, notably without any mention of Carl Sagan.
Yeah.
It has little interspersed poems in between. Besides the Emily Dickinson poem, it's generally doggerel, especially Dorian Sagan's poems, which are crap. There's actually a later poet that comes on the shows that we'll talk about who spurs even worse crap, yet absolutely decries the establishment. This was a very interesting interview, though. You go through Gaia theory, and she has such an expansive range of topics that she can talk about in regards to science. She's probably a functionary, as you've posited in your three intellects theory, but she does not. She has many different insights into Gaia theory, and she even makes sense out of a very controversial theory.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to interview her, and I got her. So she was a big get for the show, and I appreciated Art Durkee appreciated Dave Wesley. I don't think really even knew who she was, but she wouldn't do the interview unless Dorian was there. And Dorian then later joined my Cosmoetica E-list, and for the next decade or so, 8, 9, 10 years, he would often send these sort of like childish little emails. If I had said something or someone else, he was. I found him very insecure. I don't remember if in the interview he spoke about his father, Carl Sagan. I know that he had, at that point in his life, he had sent numerous emails talking about how, Carl had been a bad father and whatnot. Lynn seemed to be much more charitable towards Carl Sagan, possibly on air, but certainly off the air when I had mentioned that. She clearly knew nothing about art. The poetry, big deal. I asked her at some point there about Lauren Isley and his writing, and she talks. Well, his ideas are outdated or whatnot. I could tell she didn't really know that much. I hadn't read that much, which to me is incredible because if you want to be writing a book, a science book, I mean, Isley is the template of the great science writer. Forget whether or not he was a great scientist.
Just a great writer, period. Yeah. Imagine how much more understanding the masses would have of basic science if Einstein or if Newton were actually able to string words together as well as Lauren Isley did.
Yeah.
This is something that's often overlooked in science because it has to be communicated as effectively as the ideas are great. And if you just have great ideas and no way to communicate them in any reasonable manner, and Einstein was notable in this, then you have confusion about the masses and about your readership, rather than getting to the point. E equals mc squared. There's still people out there, especially in the laity, that have no idea what it is because Einstein was never able to communicate it very effectively and memorably.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a very good show overall. I kind of sort of wince at it because Dorian, while he knew certain stuff, it was clear that he was the junior member of the mother
Yes.
and son team. It was clear that he was sort of like a puppy that I I I had the sense, and I remember Art Durkee and both Dave Wesley. There were a few points in the show where he would say something, we'd all look at each other like, okay, that he was acting in a childish way. And I think Dave Wesley had edited some of that out, some of those sort of passive aggressive moments where he might have said something, uh, Lynn might have said something, and Dorian had said something. Well, yeah, and that's true. Certain people can't handle it, like my father. That those kinds of remarks. There was maybe 3 or 4 times that happened, but overall, it was a good show. And you know, but I kind of I a part of me always was a little bit kind of, it would have been a better show if it had just been Lynn. Uh,
Yes, it would have.
Dorian is one of those people, and the other brothers too. Nick Sagan, he has his writing career thanks to his father, and it's one thing to have this brand name, but you have to do something on your own merit. And it always seems to me when I've listened to that show 3 or 4 times in the dozen years since, is that uh, Dorian is just a little boy who's taking a crayon and going over his father's photograph with the wax and trying to scratch it out. So there's that you don't get in the show. You get a little bit of it, but the background stuff too. I always remember that, and I'm like, God. And at this point, he was in his early or mid 40s when he was doing this. I'm like, what is wrong with someone that can't get over that thing? But whatever.
Lynn does have some truck with her former husband too, in his idea that we all come from stardust.
Yeah.
That ties in with her Gaia theory. It was interesting how even as she grew apart in theory and in life from him, how much they got the same destination in the end. And
Well,
that
I think Lynn with the Gaia stuff did go a little bit to the fringe edge. I think there are some points about Gaia that are are worthy. I was just thinking today. I was listening to uh, a video, and I was thinking how uh, I, any individual, we are a part of the cosmos, but equally we are apart from the cosmos as well. The idea that, we're all part of the earth and whatnot is obviously true, but the earth itself is not a living thing. A biome is not a living creature. The earth isn't a giant one-celled animal, and we're not little parts inside of a cell. So I think she and Lovelock, who actually came up with the Gaia theory, got a little bit loopy in some of the stuff. As bad as I was just watching yesterday a thing, Dateline NBC or something. They were talking about the bleaching of coral in the Pacific Ocean, and there's a research island somewhere out in the middle of the Pacific that's protected and whatnot. And so they were talking about these things, and if coral does bleach and the temperature gets higher, I mean, life will evolve. It won't be exactly what it is, and it's a shame to miss it. But people who talk about extinctions of certain animals here as being great tragedies, or for example, people will sometimes talk in the arts about we're losing. There was one time there were 20,000 languages spoken on the planet. Now there are only 5,000 or whatever it might be. And in the next 100 years we might have less than 2,000. Well, that's just the way it goes. The loss of animals through extinction is certainly a worse problem than the loss of language. But this catastrophic notion that everything's going to die, sure, there's probably going to be pandemics. There's going to be things that happen with starvation or whatnot. But mankind isn't going to go extinct because the rate at which our technology is increasing, I think, is far outstripping the damage that we've done, to the point that we'll soon, probably by mid-century, be able to start repairing much of the damage. It may take till 2100, but my guess is within 100 years we will have conquered and mastered a lot more of the planet, whether it's weather manipulation, whether it's all of these other things. So you know, anyway, so that's just my thought. I think Lynn would have made a better interview alone without her son, but it's a good interview nonetheless, and the best of the three at that point.
The next one is on music. This is one of the more schizophrenic ones. The beginning one with your friend Mark Taylor. I think that is a pretty good take on Motown. He doesn't get into specifics like you would if you were discussing Motown music, and obviously the best parts are actually when you're speaking about music, not when Mark Taylor is. The second half, though, with Robert Levin, the only positive that can come out of that, because the essay he reads is kind of pretentious drivel, is Art Durkee kind of battling with him sometimes, and you battling with him when they're kind of waxing on how great jazz is. And jazz is one of the great frauds of music in many ways. There's specific jazz greats that you can think of. Some instrumentationalists, Ella Fitzgerald as a singer, her duets with Louis Armstrong, and things that where jazz was not just a string of masturbations, but something that got into specifics, like all art does. This is one of those kind of hit or miss interviews. I did think that it was a come down from the third interview, even
Yeah.
though the subjects were widely different.
Well, Mark is a friend of mine. We went to kindergarten together. He was the boy that I wrote the poem "Nigger" for. That I talk about in True Life. That I had called him the word "nigger" when he was bigger and stronger than me when we were in second grade, and his parents divorced, and he went through about 6 months or 12 months where he was very angry at the world, and he got into a lot of fights. And Mark was the guy who didn't even remember that I called him that. But he had hooked up with me. Maybe I found him, or somehow we had hooked up about a year or so before, and he had self-published 3 or 4 books on Motown. He apparently in the '90s had gotten involved in interviewing for these books a lot of these old-time performers from the '50s and '60s through the '70s, and he did a great job. I wanted to interview him again, and I'm gonna probably sometime when I get working again, maybe next year, start a series of interviews with people I've known about growing up together with me or where together. I'm gonna call the series Biorama. But Mark, I think, is the human being, other than my sister Christine. Mark is the human being that I'm still in contact with, that knows me from the earliest age. And he remembers things about going to kindergarten that I didn't. So it was a good, solid interview. Like I said, he's not a pro in terms of speaking or whatnot, so he was a little bit nervous, I remember. Levin was someone, I don't remember how. Oh, he was on my E-list. He had found Cosmoetica. And so when I wanted to do the soul half, I think I suggested to Art, Mark's not going to be able to fill up 2 hours. Do you want to do something on jazz? And so I said, well, we got this guy Levin on my E-list. Do you want to maybe interview him? He had a book or something come out, and again, self-published like Mark's book. And I said, you're going to have to do the jazz stuff, because I can handle the soul, because I knew more about soul than Art did, and Art knew far more about jazz than I did. So he did the jazz thing. And I agree. Mark comes off less pretentious. Mark comes off more genuine and actually loving the stuff, whereas Levin is one of these sort of super serious jazzistas.
Yeah, and then when you press him on some of his inclinations towards jazz, he kind of goes, he's kind of stumbling for his rationales to why jazz is great and whatnot. And there's even one moment that is kind of precious where he goes into that he enjoys jazz because it makes him feel superior to other people,
Yeah.
which is says far more about him than the other people he feels superior to. But let's move on to the atheism interview. Your friend Joe submitted a piece on Pascal Boyer's Religion Explained. I don't recall if that was read in the Omniversica show, but let's talk about that show. This from 5 to 6 in these interviews, you'll notice too that even if you have a specific subject like agnosticism and atheism, and then later racism, it doesn't just stick on that one topic, and it doesn't go into all the obvious points. It goes into the science of it as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's why these are far more natural conversations too. I was just talking to someone earlier about these fake mannequin-like interviews with canned questions and answers. And you really don't get any kind of perspective from how these people speak and live in their lives. But with these ones, it's like you're kind of on a subway and you see a stranger and you start talking to them, and they talk much more naturally in these than they ever do in these late night cliched crap shows that they have on late night TV, and now coming on to online as well.
Yeah, the agnosticism and atheism shows they feature some comedy segments from Ari Hopman. Ari was one of these people that I knew along with Dave Wesley from Balls. He's a terrific comedian. AriHopman.com or net, I think it's .com. Hello? Whoops. Okay, gonna have to do this.
Hello?
Oh, you there? Okay, you dropped off. You there, Peter?
You have no audio, Dan.
I can hear myself. You can't hear me? Hold on. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Could you just go off from my last question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just shut that there. So I'll delete that out. But anyway, so yeah, AriHotman.com or .net, whatever it is. Ari is a terrific comedian. He's one of those people that I don't understand. Well, I guess I can understand because he actually is a good comedian. He did have a part in one of the Coen brothers film 5 or 6 years ago, a small part, and he's very good. The Agnosticism show has a guy named Blair Scott who was headed an atheist group. He's no longer with that group now, and a guy named Bill Goett. Bill was someone I knew at this sort of religious get together. I had met him because there was a guy in Minneapolis called Ian Punnett, who's now an ordained deacon. He used to do this sort of religious group, and where they get together to talk about philosophical and stuff for an hour or two at like a local Barnes and Noble. So I went there in 02 to early 03 for maybe 5 or 6 months, maybe 5 or 6 meetings they might have had once a month. And I met this guy, Bill, there, who was, and I forget whether he's an atheist or an agnostic. I think he was the agnostic and Blair Scott was the atheist. So I met him through this fellow, Ian Punnett, who maybe at one of these days I'll interview too. Punnett later went on to host Coast to Coast, which was a show about unexplained phenomena. He was the fill-in guest host for whoever the guy who does that show is. It's a well-known show, Coast to Coast. But anyway, so we talked about that. I think it's a good, solid show. My friend Joe, I love him, but his essay didn't really contribute much. I think the race show is interesting. It was this Chinese fellow, Arthur Hu, and there also Jason Sanford had put on.
So energetic.
Yeah, Jason Sanford had an essay that he read there, which was kind of PC and banal, admittedly. But this Arthur Hu was one of these guys who he finds some goddamn statistic and he just mauled it all out of proportion. It was just kind of weird and silly, some of the arguments he made. But it was an entertaining show. I think, if I recall, Art Durkee couldn't stand him by the end of the show. I don't know if it comes through.
Exactly. They start really getting into it towards the end.
Yeah.
He's one of those minorities who is actually far more racist than most majority members. But he is very entertaining. I don't agree with pretty much anything he says, but it also shows you too that you have to be tolerant of even intolerant views and allow them to have their say and show what kind of idiocy they are. And Art, if he would have reined in a little more, actually, I think it would have been more effective, showing how stupid some of the things Arthur Who
Yeah.
said, and just let him hang
Well, it
himself.
was sort of the battling arts, and this is one of the flaws that Art had as a host, and also in his personal uh, interactions with people. Is Art lets his emotions dictate him. I don't. And you've seen it when I've done my later Dan Schneider video interviews. I've had people who are as feisty or as silly as Arthur Who in certain ways, but you have to know how to let them hang it because you're not going to be able to shout them down. They're just going to turn off, or they're going to end the interview, and they're going to walk off in a huff. So but Art Durkee, in a sense, played into some of the things that Arthur Who was setting up some of these little intellectual traps, and Art Durkee fell into a few of them, I think. Whereas I was just sitting back and I was just sort of saying, "Well, but really, blah blah blah." And meanwhile, Art Durkee was getting worked up, and I remember Art Durkee was very angry at Arthur Who by the end of that show. But so those two shows were good, solid shows. I think the best show was number 7. That's the best show I think we ever did of those dozen.
With
That's
George Dickerson, Josh Becker, and Jessica Schneider, it says here.
yeah,
Jessica doesn't play that large of a part in this. She kind of is off
yeah,
in the background and makes comments here and there. George Dickinson, very charismatic guy, very well spoken and soft spoken in ways.
yeah,
Josh Becker, he's actually very entertaining in this interview. If you've looked at his site, he still has it up.
yeah,
He is a very hit and miss critic himself.
yeah.
He will go and decry Spielberg correctly and damn him for all the shit that he's done, but then he'll go and do a review on The Thin Red Line and make it seem as if that's a bad film because it doesn't follow the traditional narrative of what he thinks a good film should be.
Yeah, and I remember, I think it's at the end of this show, Dave Wesley pipes up, and I think they're talking about that Jim Carrey film adaptation. And I don't remember if
Well, that's the Nicolas Cage thing. That's the forget the screenwriter, Charlie Kaufman.
yeah.
Right. That's the film. That's a film that had potential and then absolutely went to hell.
I don't remember if at the end of that interview we got it on recorded, or was that after the show. But I remember Art Durkee and I both thought it was, I think, not that good. George Dickerson didn't think it was. No, George Dickerson, I think, thought it was good, and Becca thought it wasn't good. So it was sort of like Dave Wesley and George arguing against me and Becker, and Art Durkee was somewhere, I think, in the middle.
Didn't George praise the film though and very oddly too, praise the film because of Cage's acting?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that it's just. Uh, I mean, George was a good guy and whatnot, but again, I remember many a conversation that I had with him when he would be talking about some films that I had seen, and he'd get the screeners because he would vote on the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for the Oscars, and I was sometimes stunned at some of the stuff that he thought was good. I don't think George would have made a particularly good critic as a film. I put him at a level in terms of understanding good and bad film with, say, a Roger Ebert. He could be sometimes spot on certain things. He certainly knew the acting business, the film business from the inside out. But again, you see these kinds of deficiencies, especially where emotion gets into play. I don't think emotion is what gets into play with someone like Beck. I mean, the guy is a B film guy. He had a couple of interesting movies. One where he did it just sort of one long take that I later reviewed 4 or 5 films of his, and he's certainly better than your typical B film schlockmeister. But again, yeah, how you can go and equate or damn both the Malick film Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan as somehow in the same vein or same qualitative level, again, just shows either emotion or just a basic limited understanding. Which, I mean, Josh Becker is not in a league with Ingmar Bergman, but it's the same blinders that someone that Bergman has on about other people's films. So it's in a sense kind of natural. But that was without a doubt, if it's not the best of the shows that we did, it was the best of the time by far.
Yes. The 8th show was with 2 other fellows.
Yeah,
this, I think, has the most memorable quote in all of the in all of the radio interviews where Frederick Glacier goes and speaks that a great artist comes out of nowhere and reshapes the world anew in terms of his art. And that's something that you later took and incorporated into the written interviews as one of those queries that parallax with other interviews. It also has, this is the poet I mentioned before, of someone who wrote even worse poetry than Dorian Sagan. Frederick Glacier actually understands some of the ins and outs of why poetry is in the hells that it is, but his poetry itself is just as bad as any of the established figures. So, in a sense, him speaking about it has no authority.
Yeah, he's declaiming on the thing, and he has no clue about the art part of it. To him, poetry is to push forth ideas, whether it's religious or artistic or whatnot. It's a vehicle by which to have voice, so to speak, which again is one of those things that I just sort of shake my head at. David Alpaugh is maybe even a worse poet in a different way. And I remember Alpaugh, when the shows got taken down by Dave Wesley, Alpaugh was angry about that, and then he wanted me to review a book of his poems. This was probably in 06 or 07. I told him I'm not writing poetry anymore, and I don't want to look at poems, reviews poems. The only since I stopped writing poems in about May or June of really about 11 years ago, I have tried to depoetize myself in a sense. I mean, I still get flooded with poetry submissions, so I'm still in that. And before we did the show, I just was giving you critique on your poems, and better critique than anyone else could probably give you. But I didn't want to review this guy's book, and then he got mad at me, and so he wanted it off my e-list, and it was just a very childish reaction. That's what I remember about him. Frederick Glacier also, I think, is a real estate agent somewhere up in Michigan. A nice enough guy, but he reminds me of this guy who did The New World, Frederick Turner, this long poem that Jessica had Frederick Turner as a professor. Turner was another one of these guys who would talk all about these pseudoscientific methods. And I think I have still 2 or 3 essays that Frederick Turner wrote about poetry up on Cosmoetica.
Yeah, some of the worst essays that you have on the
site. Yeah, these people who have no clue about what the fuck they are talking about. Now, Glacier certainly could probably be a passable critic of poetry if he, but he would probably come across some poetry that he liked, and all of his good ideas would go out the window. So it's an interesting show. I think it's a successful show, but it's successful not so much because Alpaugh and Glacier are such great poets or poetry critics, but because you get a real sense of what's fundamentally wrong with poetry because of these two guys and their very much limited view on poetry.
The next show is with Fiorella Terenzi and Jeffrey Mishlove.
Yeah.
This was a very interesting show itself. I do think that the woman has some views and some writings that are absolutely out there in Pluto. Jeffrey Mishlove speaks intelligently. He's a little reserved in this interview, I find, as to opposed to some of the other things that I've seen him in. But speak a little bit of that. It's
well, Fiorella Terenzi,
science, and it certainly does have some wacky ideas.
Back in the late 90s, early O's, I think she's about 4 or 5 years older than me. So she's in her mid to late 50s now, maybe pushing 60. But, she was called, I guess, the Madonna of astronomy or something, because she released this album or this CD of like whale songs or something. And like, even if I look here, I can see her, she's this boobalicious babe, platinum blonde bombshell, and she looks like she's like some super sex goddess from an Antonioni type film. She almost looks like a more sexed up version of Monica Vitti, doing Jane Fonda workout stuff. But she was very nice. She's a very intelligent woman. And her part was pretty good. Mishlove was someone who had this show called Thinking Aloud on PBS in the late 80s through the mid 90s, 6 or 7 years, and he's a very good interviewer himself. But yeah, he founded something called the Institute. Well, he was involved with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded by Edgar Mitchell, the scientist, and for a lot of years he was involved with that. And he has some, whacked out, way out beliefs too. But he was very nice enough guy. He's very interesting. So yeah, I mean that's a show that again is an interesting pairing. I think when Fiorella, her whacked out beliefs, there's some interaction between them where they're like, "Oh, Jeffrey, yes," and she asked him a question or two. I think so. I remember that was
She interacts.
yeah. So that was
That was an interesting aspect as compared to some of the other ones that where you have multiple guests and they kind of just do their parts and not, but these two interacted and kind of had not disagreements but kind of overlaid on their points.
yeah.
The next show was on poetry. It's the Uptown Poetry Group that Dylan Garcia Wald, Sindra Helm, Jen Hannell, Don Moss, and Jessica Schneider, along with yourself and Art Durkee,
And Robert
all
Newkirk.
sorry,
And
and
the guy
Robert
named
Newkirk,
Robert
right?
Newkirk.
Yes, and this was perhaps at least the top two of the interviews that you did.
Mm.
I think that it's a terrific show. It's got into the depths of poetry. It won't recapitulate all the points. People can listen to them for themselves. But speak a little bit about that one. Robert Newkirk, at some one point, you ask him, if I recall correctly, whether he's been traumatized a little bit of the critiques, and he does say that he does find it a tough process. Don Moss also shows that his wit is very natural to him. He can come up with little witticisms on the spot, and I would have enjoyed if he would have spoken a bit more than he did.
Yeah, Jen Hannell was a gal who came a handful of times in the last year or so that the UPG was going. She had a little bit of talent here or there. Sindra Helm was the gal I mentioned in an earlier interview that Jessica had some issues with because she was the gal who didn't want her stuff online. She was afraid people were going to plagiarize her or something. And she came, I think, 3 or 4 times to the UPG. But when I asked people who had come, she was willing to do it, which was interesting because she wasn't willing to really go to the UPG regularly and actually help other people. But when it came to possibly promoting herself, she was very available. To a lesser degree, Dylan was the same way. He came maybe 7 or 8 times to the UPG, and we had 200 meetings exactly. But he was on the spot to promote himself. But yeah, it's again a good show about poetry or whatnot. I think I came up with the idea because I was having trouble getting someone who is like a name or whatnot. So that's how that evolved, and like you said, it's a good show. It had its moments and whatnot.
It had some good points, particularly by you and Art Durkee, regarding the technical side of poetry too, that I think young writers would be advised to listen to. Dylan Garcia Wall, were there poem segments interspersed like the previous ones? I don't recall. I think some of your poems were
Yeah, it was.
one, but I would have been it would have been interesting to hear some of Dylan's poems. They are some of the best that you have in the first Magnifique.
Yeah, the thing I do remember is Don Moss and Art Durkee. They never disliked each other, but they were the sort of polar opposites at the UPG. And I remember, I think when Art said some things, I remember Don rolling his eyes a few times. I don't remember what they were about. Don, in the years since, has gotten more right wing. He became a religious person, Christian, whatnot. He moved to Georgia. He was originally from Virginia, moved to Georgia. He's written one of the great long poems of the last 100 years, uh, um, Dominions. And Art sort of flaked out and went the other way. I think I've said he's had a number of problems. He had some physical problems. He lost a job and then has floundered around ever since. His parents died. He had some psycho-emotional problems here and there, and I've lost touch with him. I mean, occasionally I still hear from him, but I remember Don and Art were always sort of at loggerheads at the UPG when they were there at the same time, and so that's basically my memory of that show.
With the UPG, just as a final aside, what do you think? and I already know, but you can elaborate on it. What do you think puts it apart from other writing groups? And also, do you think that there is an inherent value in showcasing your poems to other people? Because I think that while there is value to it, you do have to get outside of the hand holding and figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, there is value. I mean, you have to get outside of yourself. Most people don't get outside of themselves. Most people are solipsistic, and that's just the way it is. Most people are about themselves. When I was talking about your poem earlier about getting using the second person rather than the third, or getting rid of some of the second person references, that's one of those things. And I'm not saying your poem is solipsistic, but a lot of people about I, the constant first person, I, this confessional shit. So you need to get outside of it. And the basic difference between the Uptown Poetry Group and me was me, in that I set the ground rules. I said, we're not going to do politically correct bullshit. Someone can say that they dislike your poem or they think it's bad poem, and I would always try to emphasize, tell why you think it's bad, not that you dislike it. This is something that obviously I'm always harping on because I'm seen to be one of the few people in the world that it's default for me to talk about good and bad rather than like and dislike. Um, and so I wouldn't let people get away with that kind of thing. I try not to let people get away with bullshit. Um, and and so by doing that, you have a smaller group of people. A lot of people came just once and were like, "Oh, they were mean or whatnot." Well, then you're not really a serious artist if that's what you think. Um, uh, and so that's basically the difference, and that's why the UPG was successful. 200 times consecutively, twice a month for whatever it was, 8 full years plus 4 months or 3 months, whatever it was. No other poetry group that I ever knew of in New York ever did the same. You would have these groups with like old ladies who'd get together for 20 years or something, but they weren't really criticizing. I'd gone to groups like that, but a real critique group, no. It was a unique thing, and the very fact that you had people like me, like Jess, like Don Moss, like Bruce Ario, like Art Durkee, like Dylan Wall on occasion, and a number of other people. Robert Newkirk had some talent too. Uh, I know, having gone to dozens of groups over the years before then and here or there after, there was never a collection of poems submitted that was better. And in fact, I think I mentioned this earlier. One of the things Art later grew to resent was the fact that he was at his best as a poet when he came to the UPG. And years later, he had a falling out with Jessica and then later with me because he thought my stating that was somehow demeaning to him. No, it's not demeaning. That's the reality. That's the purpose of the group. That's an endorsement of what the group was and how effectively it worked. Is that beforehand, Art Durkee wasn't as good a poet. In the 5 or 6 years that he came to the UPG, he wrote the best poems. And I've seen the poems, and you've probably looked online, I think you said,
Yes.
at his stuff. The stuff that there does not compare to that 4 or 5 poems that I've got on UPG. And the other 2 or 3 dozen poems of his that were of the highest quality that I had seen at the UPG.
I
So
think Art Durkee has talent, or even great talent in some ways, but he clearly doesn't understand about objectivity because he'll go and defend subjectivity, even though objectivity works so well for him in the UPG. And you
yeah,
can see some very memorable and great poems that he wrote, and then he just decides to throw that away for this whole subjective argument just so that he can justify his likes and his biases and some of the shit that he wrote later on.
subjectivity can help you feel good, and people like to feel good above all else, especially when other things go wrong in their life.
But I agree with you when you say that you have to get outside of yourself, because once you do that, you kind of rise up and you can see yourself the same size as everyone else, and you're just a bunch of little ants, and you can start picking apart things much more easily once that happens, and it has to become natural to you. Like you said, you have default good and bad and not like and dislike. Like and dislike is the things of kids, and good and bad is the stuff for adults.
Mm.
The next interview is with Leonard Schlein. This is one of the lesser interviews, and I don't even think it's a good interview. Not that it is you. not that it is your fault or Art Durkee's fault, but it was simply unmovable in any of his in his views. He was very condescending and rude throughout the entire interview, especially when you pointed out the lesser status of his book Sex, Time, and Power. Art and physics, or space time or parallel visions in space, time, and light is a excellent guide towards art. But I've read some of the things that he wrote since, and they weren't nearly as cogent and well wrought. This interview, I think, is one of the failures, but it's a failure on Leonard Shlain's part and not on the interviewers.
Yeah, Shlain was an asshole. I mean, he died a few years ago. He comes across smug. I remember, I think I said just before that there was another interview where, oh, it was with Dorian Sagan, I think, that Shlain undershot Dorian Sagan. Dorian, behind the scenes, was complaining about not getting as much time to speak as his mother, that kind of thing. He wanted to sometimes be asked questions first in the earlier show. Shlain, I remember, I believe, I can't be certain, but I think there was a time when in between a break, he and Art had gone off talking about one of the things that they had talked about, and Shlain told Art Durkee to shut up or something like that. And I think, I could be wrong, it might have been towards the end of the show, but I think if you look at the last 20 or 30% of the show, I think Art Durkee doesn't say as much because he was really angry at Shlain. And yeah, it was odd because his Sex, Time, and Power is such a piece of shit book. And you know, Shlain himself was a heart surgeon, so he wasn't an art expert, but and he wasn't even really trained in physics, but he wrote this very good book that helped me in the early to mid '90s when I first read it understand one of the reasons why I give me the vocabulary to understand why a painting or a certain style could work over another style. But yet he had no clue. He was so rigid. So I think he was a classic example of a dart tosser. He had that one book
and
in him.
a god complex.
Yeah. And like I said, he came across as a very nasty person. I think at the end of the show, even Dave Wesley, like, boy, he's a fucking asshole. And I can say that now because he's dead.
When you start criticizing the book, and I mean, you're not going into it as you are right now. You were saying, well, it's not good, Leonard, and you were trying to get into it, and then he cuts you off, so he won't even hear you out. And then this is one of the things that irritates me in a lot of these interviews is that people have to hear each other out. If he disagrees with you, then he should destroy you in the argument if he has some evidence, rather than just stifling your opinion. But he speaks about how the reason that his latest book succeeds is because he has some poetic license. He doesn't write in the style of academia, but the truth is that he actually does. Even in art and physics, it's not, great prose that moves it along. It's the ideas. It is well wrought for what it is, but it's just a guide. It's nothing that will be out there years from now and people will go to and think about life deeper. It only shows you how to think about art deeper and to look at things different. And it has some hit and miss moments too. There's asides on abstract expressionism that are horrid, that are talking about literal bird shit on canvas as if it's some kind of primitive ritual dance that they changed into this bird shit canvas.
Yeah. And so then the last show was Godfrey Reggio, who did the Quatsi films, and Howard Bloom. And I forget which book we focus on of Bloom's at the time. Bloom is the only person that has appeared in all three iterations of my interviews. He did a written interview, he did Omniversica, and then later he appeared in a Dan Schneider video interview. And who knows, in the next 5, 6 years, however long I do these interviews, maybe, I'm sure he'll appear once or twice more. That was a show, that was the last show. We knew we were going to end it because after I think the 9th or 10th show, Dave Wesley didn't like the show. And I still don't understand. The shows we did, even the worst, the bottom 2 or 3 shows, were still leagues above his shows that he had in Sursum Corda. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, that's fine. I was at that point, Jess and I were going to move to Texas, and but the shows were so good, and on the whole, they were so seminal in a sense. Again, this people don't realize this was before podcasting existed. This was before YouTube existed that these shows were being done. So and he wasn't getting enough hits that he said because his audience, I guess, were a bunch of slackers, musical Midwest musical slackers, and they weren't interested in the stuff we were talking about. So Reggio and Bloom were talking about. I think it's transcendence, the topic, and I think both of those interviews went very well. Um, uh, Bloom is a fantastic interview. He's very, Howard Bloom. He called himself Big Howie on his own YouTube channel. It's like Ask Big Howard, or he uses some kind of name like that. He's
Yes.
unintentionally funny, but um, and I
I
think
think there's a little bit of intent of humor for that.
yeah,